the silence between words. The air in the old Victorian house felt thick, like it was holding its breath. Adeline, no, her name was Elena, but to him she was simply mine, moved through the kitchen. With a quiet grace that made his pulse throb in his jaw, he was positioned in the crawl space above the ceiling, a place he had reinforced weeks ago. Through the tiny pin-sized camera feed on his monitor, he watched her fingers brush against the kettle. He could hear the click of the stove, the hum of the refrigerator, and the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing. He knew that breath. He had timed his own to match it every night for the last month. Elena shivered, her hand pausing over the tea tin. She turned slowly, her wide, honey-colored eyes scanning the empty kitchen. "Is someone there?" she whispered. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He loved when she felt him. It was a tether, a dark wire stretched taut between his chest and hers. He watched as she walked toward the back door, checking the lock he had picked and relocked just an hour ago. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood, her shoulders shaking slightly. She felt the walls closing in, but she didn't realize it was because he was the one pulling them toward her. He shifted his weight silently, his eyes fixed on the screen as she moved back to the counter. He reached out, his gloved finger tracing the curve of her neck on the monitor. "Check your phone, Elena," he hissed into the silence of his dark hiding spot. As if hearing his command, she reached for her device. He watched her face go pale as she saw the notification. No sender, just a photo. It was a picture taken from 3 minutes ago. A shot of her back as she stood at the stove, the steam from the kettle rising around her like a shroud. She dropped the phone. It clattered onto the hardwood floor, the screen cracking. She let out a small, strangled sob and backed into the corner of the kitchen, her eyes darting to the shadows. "Who are you?" she screamed at the empty room. He leaned back, a cold, jagged smile spreading across his face. He loved the fear. It was the only thing she had that he hadn't given her yet. "I'm the only one who sees you, Elena," he whispered to the screen. "And I'm the only one who's going to keep you." He watched her slide down the wall, burying her face in her knees. He didn't look away. He wouldn't miss a single tear. He sat there in the dark, a predator watching his prize break, waiting for the perfect moment to descend and put the pieces back together in his own image. She is trapped in the corner of the kitchen, terrified. The silence in the kitchen was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Elena stayed slumped against the baseboards, her chest heaving as she stared at the cracked screen of her phone lying 3 feet away. It was a glowing eye in the dark, a reminder that she wasn't alone. High above, nestled in the dark ribs of the house, he watched the sweat bead on her upper lip. He took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the scent of her terror that seemed to rise through the floorboards. He didn't want to touch her yet. The anticipation was a drug, and he wanted to be high on it for a little while longer. He tapped a few keys on his handheld deck. The interface was black, the code red, the color of his intent. Downstairs, the silence was shattered. Every smart speaker in the house let out a sharp, rhythmic thump-thump. The sound of a heartbeat, his heartbeat, recorded and amplified until the floorboards vibrated beneath her. Elena let out a sharp gasp, scrambling further into the corner, her nails scratching against the wallpaper. "Stop it, please." He ignored her plea. Instead, he sent the command. Her phone vibrated violently against the wood. Bzzzt, bzzzt. She stared at it, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She didn't want to pick it up, but the compulsion was too strong. Fear had made her a puppet, and he held every string. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over the glass before she finally snatched it up. A new message sat on the screen. "Your heart is racing, Elena, 112 beats per minute. You should be careful. A heart that works that hard eventually gives out." She dropped the phone again as if it had burned her. How do you know that?" She choked out, her voice breaking. She clutched her chest, her fingers digging into the fabric of her shirt. Right over her thudding heart, he leaned closer to his monitor, his eyes dilating until the irises were almost gone. He could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. "Because I'm closer than you think," he whispered into the dark, his voice a low vibration that she couldn't hear, but he felt it in his own bones. He decided to turn the screw one more time. He didn't just want her afraid. He wanted her to know that her sanctuary was a cage. He sent a command to the kitchen's overhead lights. Flicker, flicker, pop. The bulb directly above her shattered, raining tiny shards of glass onto the floor beside her. Elena screamed, tucking her head into her arms, shaking violently. In the sudden dimness, the only light came from the small undercabinet, EDs, and they began to pulse in time, with the heartbeat sound still thumping through the speakers. Then he sent the final text of the night. "The back door is unlocked now, Elena. I wonder, will you run into the dark where I'm waiting? Or will you stay in that corner and wait for me to come to you?" The sound of the deadbolt sliding open echoed through the quiet kitchen like a gunshot clack. Elena froze. Her eyes flew to the door. It swung open just an inch, admitting a sliver of the cold midnight air. She is staring at the open door, the invitation to run, or the threat of what's outside. Elena didn't run. He felt a surge of jagged pride slice through his chest as he watched her on the monitor. Most people would have bolted into the night, right into his waiting arms, but she stayed. She was a fighter. She was a little bird with clipped wings still trying to sharpen her beak. She began to crawl, her knees scraping over the hardwood and the stray shards of the shattered light bulb. Each movement was agonizingly slow, her eyes never leaving the sliver of darkness peering through the open back door. She was headed for the granite island, toward the shadow of the wooden knife block. He watched her hand reach up, trembling so violently she nearly knocked a ceramic vase over. Her fingers wrapped around the hilt of the largest chef's knife. The steel glinted in the rhythmic, pulsing red glow of the kitchen lights. "That's it, Elena," he rasped, his own hand tightening into a fist in the dark. "Show me how much you want to live." She pulled the blade from the block with a metallic shing that echoed the heartbeat, still thumping from the speakers. She held it with both hands, pressing her back against the kitchen island, facing the open door. She was gasping for air, the knife shaking in her grip. He decided it was time to show her that a weapon was only useful if you knew where the enemy was. He tapped a command into his deck. Slowly, the motorized blinds on every window in the kitchen began to descend at the exact same time. The whirring of the motors was a mechanical growl sealing her inside. One by one, they hit the sills with a heavy thud, cutting off any view of the outside world. She was now trapped in a box of his making. Then he cut the speakers. The heartbeat stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back in was deafening, amplified only by the sound of the wind whistling through the inch-wide gap in the back door. Elena gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white.
"I'll kill you!"
She shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and adrenaline. "I swear to God I'll kill you if you come near me." He felt a dark, low chuckle vibrate in his throat. He reached for his heavy boots, pulling them on and lacing them with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't need to be in the crawlspace anymore. He wanted to hear her voice without a microphone. He stood up, the floorboards above her not making a single sound. He had reinforced them with rubber padding months ago for this very moment. He moved to the hidden wall panel that led to the service stairs. Downstairs, Elena saw the shadow, not at the open back door, but at the pantry door, the one behind her. A floorboard creaked. Just once. She spun around, the knife extended, her breath hitching in her throat. The pantry door was vibrating. Something was pressing against it from the other side. Psst! Her phone, still on the floor, lit up one more time. "You're looking the wrong way, little bird." The back door, which had been open an inch, suddenly slammed shut with a violent force that shook the entire house. The locks engaged, click, 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 sealing her in. She is spinning between the pantry door and the back door. The knife held out like a shield. The pantry door didn't just open. It groaned. A slow and agonizing protest of wood on metal. Elena's head snapped toward the sound, her scream dying in her parched throat. She thrust the chef's knife forward, her arms shaking so hard the tip of the blade danced in the dim, pulsing red light. Then he stepped out. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying fluidness of a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He was a mountain of solid, dark intent, filling the narrow doorway. He wore a tactical black jacket that made his shoulders look impossibly wide, and a mask that obscured everything but those eyes. Eyes that were fixed on her with a hunger that was almost physical. Elena recoiled, her heels hitting the base of the kitchen island. "No," she whimpered, the knife dipping for a second before she jerked it back up. "Stay back." "I'll do it. I'll kill you." He stopped exactly 6 feet away. He didn't look threatened by the steel in her hand. He looked amused. He tilted his head to the side, watching her. In the low light, his silhouette was a jagged tear in the reality of her safe, quiet life. "You're shaking, Elena," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape, not the distorted version she'd heard through the speakers, but his real voice. It was deep, resonant, and carried the weight of a man who had never been told no. "Put the knife down before you hurt yourself," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from a king to a subject. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" she sobbed, her chest heaving as she tried to find a weakness in the dark figure before her. He took a single, heavy step forward. The floor didn't creak. It seemed to groan under the sheer force of his presence. Elena lunged, a desperate, uncoordinated swipe of the blade meant to keep him back. He didn't flinch. He didn't even move his hands from his sides. He simply watched the cold steel whistle through the air, inches from his chest. "I want exactly what I have," he rasped, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously intimate. "I want you trapped. I want you terrified. And I want you to realize that no matter how hard you fight, you are already mine." He took another step, closing the distance until the tip of her knife was pressing against the center of his chest, right over his heart. He didn't stop. He leaned into the blade, forcing her to hold the weight of him. "Push, Elena," he challenged, his eyes boring into hers. "If you want me gone, drive it in. But we both know you won't. You've been waiting for someone to look at you the way I do. You've been lonely in this big empty house. Admit it." The knife trembled against his jacket. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart through the metal. It was a terrifying contrast to her own frantic pulse. He is leaning his full weight against the knife she's holding, daring her to become the predator. He didn't wait for her to make a choice. He made it for her. As the tip of the steel began to pierce the outer fabric of his jacket, his arm moved with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't swat the knife away. He ignored it entirely, his large, leather-gloved hand surging upward. His fingers clamped around the delicate column of her throat. Elena let out a choked, truncated gasp as he slammed her backward against the kitchen island. The impact jarred her entire frame, and the chef's knife clattered to the floor, forgotten, as her hands instinctively flew up to claw at the black leather encircling her neck. He didn't squeeze hard enough to crush her windpipe, just enough to let her know he could, just enough to make every breath a gift he was personally granting her. "There it is," he hissed, looming over her, his massive frame pinning her against the granite. That spark of realization. He leaned in closer, his mask inches from her face. She could smell him now, rain, expensive cedar wood, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, even as his palm maintained its iron grip on her throat. "You think that little piece of metal makes you dangerous?" He tilted his head, his dark eyes devouring the sight of her pupils blown wide with terror. "I've walked through fire to get to this room. Elena, you think a kitchen knife was going to stop me from taking what belongs to me?" Elena tried to speak, but only a broken, pathetic whimper escaped her lips. Tears tracked down her cheeks, disappearing into the collar of his glove. She was completely mastered, her feet barely touching the floor as he held her in place. "Look at me," he growled, his voice vibrating through her very bones. "Stop looking at the door. Stop looking for an exit. There is no one else in the world right now but you and me. Do you understand?" He increased the pressure slightly, forcing her chin up, making her meet his gaze. The red LED lights in the kitchen pulsed one last time before dying out, leaving them bathed in the suffocating, gray moonlight filtering through the cracks in the blinds. "I have watched you sleep. I have watched you cry. I have seen every version of you that you hide from the world," he whispered, his thumb now pressing against her bottom lip, dragging it down to reveal her trembling teeth. "And now I'm going to see the version of you that only exists for me." He lowered his head, his breath hot against her ear. "Say my name, Elena. I know you found it in your grandmother's letters. Say it and I might let you breathe." She is paralyzed, her life literally in the palm of his hand. The silence he had enforced was broken only by the sound of her frantic, shallow gasps. He didn't wait for her to find her voice. He didn't want words anymore. He wanted her compliance, her weight, her total submission to the reality he had spent months constructing. With a sudden, powerful movement, he released her throat, only to dive lower. Before she could even draw a full breath to scream, his arm hooked behind her knees and his other arm locked around her lower back. He hoisted her off the ground as if she weighed nothing at all. Elena's world tilted. She let out a sharp, panicked cry, her hands instinctively grabbing at his shoulders to steady herself. The contact made him growl, a low, predatory sound of satisfaction. He pulled her flush against his chest, her heart hammering against his tactical vest like a bird trapped in a cage. "Put me down, please," she sobbed, her legs kicking weakly against the air. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He turned away from the kitchen, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the hardwood as he moved toward the dark maw of the hallway. Each step was a nail in the coffin of her freedom. "You're going to find that the upstairs is much more comfortable, little bird," he murmured, his voice cutting through the dark. "I've made sure of it." He reached the foot of the stairs. The grand staircase loomed above them, disappearing into the pitch-black shadows of the second floor. The house felt different now, no longer her home but his fortress. Elena looked back over his shoulder at the kitchen, her eyes searching for the knife on the floor, the open pantry, any shred of the life she'd had 10 minutes ago. But the hallway light flickered and died behind them, swallowed by a darkness that seemed to follow him. As he began the steady climb up the stairs, he tightened his grip, his fingers digging into the soft skin of her thigh. He felt her go limp in his arms, the fight finally draining out of her, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. "That's it," he whispered, his head dipping down so his mask brushed against her temple. "Give up, Elena. I've got you. I've always had you." He reached the top landing and turned toward her bedroom. He didn't need a light. He knew every inch of this floor. He had walked these halls while she slept, paced the length of her rug, sat in the chair in the corner of her room and watched her dream. He kicked her bedroom door open. It hit the wall with a dull thud. The room was bathed in the glow of a dozen candles he must have lit while she was downstairs in the kitchen, a flickering, golden altar to his obsession. He carries her over the threshold and toward the bed he has prepared for her. He didn't give her a second to adjust to the flickering candlelight. The moment he reached the edge of the bed, he dropped her not with cruelty, but with a terrifying efficiency. Before the mattress could even stop bouncing from the weight of her body, he was over her. He lunged, his massive frame descending like a collapsing ceiling. Elena let out a sharp oomph as the air was driven from her lungs. He pinned her wrists above her head with one hand, his fingers overlapping easily around both of her delicate joints. He used his other forearm to press across her collarbone, not choking her this time, but anchoring her down so firmly she felt like she was being fused into the fabric of the bed. "Look at the room." "Elena," he commanded, his voice a dark, jagged rasp in the silence. She tried to turn her head away, her chest heaving, but he shifted his weight, his knee driving between her thighs to keep her legs from kicking. He was a cage made of muscle and black leather. "Look at it." Her tear-filled eyes darted around the room. It was hers, yet it wasn't. He had moved things. Her books were lined up in a different order. Her jewelry was spread out on the vanity like a display. And the candles, dozens of them, were melting into her furniture, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like reaching hands. "I've spent more time in this room than you have lately," he whispered, leaning down until the cold material of his mask was grazing her ear. "I know which floorboard creaks when you get up in the night. I know you sleep on the left side because you like the breeze from the window. I know the exact sound you make right before you wake up." Elena shivered, a sob racking her frame. "You're a monster," she choked out. He let out a low, dry laugh that sent a chill straight down her spine. "I am whatever you need me to be. Your shadow, your guard, your nightmare." He shifted his grip on her wrists, tightening it until she gasped. He leaned his face down, his dark eyes locking onto hers through the slits of his mask. The heat radiating off him was stifling. "Do you know why I pinned you down, Elena? Why I'm not letting you move an inch?" She shook her head frantically against the pillow, her hair spreading out like a dark halo. "Because I want you to feel the weight of me. I want you to understand that this bed, this room, this house is no longer yours. It's our sanctuary, and the only way you're leaving it is if I'm carrying you." He slowly released her wrists, but he didn't move his body. Instead, he reached down for his belt. Elena's eyes went wide, her breath hitching in a new kind of panic. But he didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The cold metal clinked in the candlelight, a sharp final sound. He has her pinned and the cuffs are out. The metallic snap of the first cuff locking, around her right wrist, sounded like a prison door closing. He moved with a brutal, practiced grace, hauling her other hand toward it until the steel ratcheted shut, binding her hands together in front of her chest. Elena let out a broken cry, her bound hands instinctively pushing against his chest, but it was like trying to move a mountain. He didn't budge. Instead, he used his forearm to press her hands down into the mattress, right above her heart, effectively pinning her with her own weight. "Look at me, Elena," he growled. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and disappearing into her temple. "I said, look at me." His voice carried a vibration that demanded obedience, a tone that made her skin crawl and her heart skip. Slowly, her lashes fluttered open, her honeyed eyes wide and glassy with a terror that was slowly turning into a dark, hypnotic trance. His hand went to the back of his head. The sound of the Velcro in the rustle of the fabric felt deafening in the candlelit room. He pulled the mask away slowly, intentionally, letting the tension stretch until it was paper thin. As the mask fell to the floor, Elena's breath hitched. He wasn't the scarred, deformed monster she had imagined in her darkest nightmares. He was striking, devastatingly so. His jaw was a sharp, clean line of granite covered in a dark, well-groomed stubble. His nose had been broken once, giving him a rugged, dangerous edge. But it was his eyes that truly paralyzed her. They weren't cold. They were burning with a terrifying, obsessive fire. They were a dark, stormy gray, looking at her as if she were the only thing in the universe that mattered. "Do you recognize me now?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. Elena's lips parted, her voice a mere ghost of a sound. "You, the coffee shop, the man in the park, everywhere," he corrected, a dark, possessive smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I have been every shadow you felt behind you, every stranger you thought you saw in the crowd. I have lived on the periphery of your life, Elena, waiting for the moment you were finally ready to be mine." He reached out, his bare hand, no longer gloved, stroking her cheek. His skin was hot, his touch unexpectedly gentle, which made the underlying violence of the situation feel even more wrong. "You're even more beautiful when you're looking at me without the fear of the unknown," he murmured, his thumb catching her bottom lip and pulling it down just enough to see the pink of her inner lip. "Now you know exactly who is holding you. Now you know exactly who you belong to." He leaned down further, his nose brushing against hers, his scent of cedar and rain now overwhelming her senses. "Say it, Elena. Say you belong to me." She is staring into the face of her captor, the man who has been a phantom in her life for months. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving only the heat radiating between them. Elena stared into those stormy gray eyes, her bound wrists trembling against his chest. The man standing before her wasn't a stranger anymore. He was the architect of her fear, the silent witness to her life, and the only person who had ever looked at her with such terrifying singular focus. Her resistance didn't break all at once. It dissolved, washed away by the sheer intensity of his gaze and the crushing weight of his presence. She felt a strange, dark vertigo, a falling sensation that had nothing to do with the bed beneath her. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the crackle of the candles. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He waited, his jaw tight, his thumb still hooked over her bottom lip, holding her open for him. "I belong to you," she whispered. The words felt like a betrayal to her soul, but as they left her lips, a shiver of something that wasn't just fear raced down her spine. The moment the confession was out, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The predatory tension didn't vanish, it sharpened. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat, half growl, half sigh of relief. It was the sound of a man finally reaching the end of a long, blood-soaked journey. "Again," he commanded, his voice dropping to a jagged, intimate thread. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, forcing her to breathe the same air he exhaled. "Say it again, Elena, own it." "I belong to you," she repeated, her voice steadier this time, laced with the exhaustion of someone who had finally stopped fighting the tide. "Everything. It's all yours." He let out a sharp, jagged breath and suddenly buried his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin right above her pulse point. Elena gasped, her bound hands clenching into fists against his shoulders. She felt the raw, unhinged power of his obsession. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that she was now wrapped in. "Mine," he vibrated against her skin. "Every tear, every breath, every heartbeat. You have no idea how long I've waited to hear you admit it." He pulled back just enough to look at her again, his expression bordering on the fanatical. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the key to the handcuffs. The metallic chink was the only sound in the room as he unlocked them, But as her hands fell free, he immediately caught her wrists again, pinning them to the pillow on either side of her head. He didn't need the steel anymore. Her words had bound her tighter than any chain could. "Now that you've said it," he whispered, his eyes dark with a promise of total possession. "I'm never letting you take it back. Do you understand? There is no world outside this room anymore." He has her uncuffed but completely pinned by his own strength. The psychological trap finally closed. He didn't wait for another word. The confession was the permission he had already stolen, the final brick in the wall he'd built around her. He stared at her mouth for a long, agonizing heartbeat, his pupils blown wide, consuming the honey gold of her irises before he finally tilted his head. When his mouth crashed against hers, it wasn't a question. It was a conquest. The kiss was everything his obsession had been: dark, overwhelming, and utterly possessive. It tasted of salt from her tears and the sharp, metallic tang of the adrenaline still singing in the air. He didn't just want her lips. He wanted to consume her entire being. He claimed her mouth with a starved intensity, his tongue a heavy, insistent heat that demanded she open for him. Elena let out a muffled whimper against his lips, her fingers curling into the sheets as the world tilted and spun. It was a sensory overload, the weight of his body crushing her into the mattress, the scent of cedarwood and rain filling her lungs, and the sheer terrifying intimacy of his touch. He groaned into the kiss, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through her chest. One of his hands released her wrist to tangle in her hair, his fingers anchoring her head to the pillow, forcing her to take every ounce of his passion. He kissed her until her lungs burned, until the room blurred into a haze of candlelight and shadows, and until the only reality left was the pressure of his mouth on hers. When he finally pulled back just an inch, he was breathing as hard as she was. His lips were wet, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. "That's the first and last time you'll ever taste another soul." "Elena," he rasped, his voice thick with a terrifying promise. "You are sealed. You are marked. You are mine to keep and mine to break." He trailed his lips down to her jawline, his stubble grazing her skin before settling at her ear. "Now," he whispered, his hand sliding down from her hair to rest heavily over her heart. "Let's talk about your new rules. Starting with the fact that you'll never be alone again." He is hovering over her, his thumb tracing her swollen lips. He didn't move from his position over her. He liked her pinned, her hair a messy silk fan across his pillow, her lips still stained with the pressure of his. He reached out to her bedside table and picked up a small, sleek tablet that looked out of place among her grandmother's antique lace and dust. The screen flickered to life, casting a cold blue glow over their faces, cutting through the warm candlelight. "You like your privacy, Elena, I know that," he whispered, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "But privacy is just another word for unprotected. And I will never let you be unprotected again." He swiped his finger across the screen. A grid appeared, a dozen different camera angles of the very room they were in. One from the ceiling fan, one from the corner of the wardrobe, even one hidden inside the hollowed-out spine of her favorite book on the nightstand. Elena's breath hitched. She saw herself on the screen, a small, trembling figure held down by a shadow. "I've replaced the glass in these windows," he continued, gesturing toward the dark panes behind them. "It's reinforced, shatterproof. You could throw a brick at it and it wouldn't even spiderweb. The locks on the door are biometric. They only respond to me. If you try to open them, a silent alarm trips on my phone before the handle even turns." He leaned in closer, the tablet's blue light reflecting in his gray eyes like ice. "Every vent is filtered. Every wire is shielded. This room is a fortress. Elena, not even a radio signal gets in or out unless I allow it. I've cut the landline. And your cell phone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the shattered remains of her device, dropping the pieces onto the bed beside her. "It's gone. You don't need the world. You only need the man who's standing in front of you." He scrolled to another app on the tablet. A map of the house appeared, glowing with red lines, motion sensors, and heat signatures. "If you leave this bed without me, I'll know. If you cry in your sleep, I'll hear it. If you try to scream for help, the sound-dampening foam, I've lined the walls with will swallow your voice before it even reaches the hallway." He set the tablet down and gripped her chin, forcing her to look away from the screens and back at him. "I've spent $500 million turning this house into your world," he rasped. "You wanted to feel safe, didn't you? Now you are the safest woman on the planet. Because the only person who can get to you is me. He is watching her process the fact that she is in a high-tech cage. He saw the way her eyes darted toward the camera hidden in the bookshelf. A flicker of defiance, or perhaps just the desperate urge to break. Something crossing her face. His jaw tightened. He didn't want her to just understand the walls. He wanted her to fear the wires. "Thinking about breaking my toys, Elena?" he whispered, his voice turning ice cold. He grabbed her bound wrists and hauled her upright, dragging her toward the corner of the room where a small, unassuming black box was mounted near the ceiling. It looked like a standard smoke detector, but as they got closer, a tiny red light began to blink rapidly. "This is the heart of the system," he said, his hand snaking out to grip her neck, forcing her to look up at the device. "It's not just a sensor. It's a deterrent." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic rod, a piece of scrap metal. "Watch." He tossed the metal toward the device. Before it could even make contact, a sharp, invisible crackle of electricity hissed through the air. A concentrated arc of blue light jumped from the box, striking the metal rod with a violent snap. The smell of ozone and scorched metal immediately filled the small space between them. The rod hit the floor, glowing orange at the tip, completely fried. Elena shrieked, flinching back into his chest. He didn't let her move. He held her there, forced to look at the smoking piece of metal on her rug. "That's a non-lethal pulse, Elena. It's designed to fry anything that interferes with the signal." He rasped into her ear, his grip on her neck tightening just enough to make her gasp. "But I can calibrate it. If you try to pull those cameras down, or if you try to short the door lock while I'm away, the pulse won't hit the floor. It'll hit you." He turned her around in his arms, pinning her against the wall right beneath the sensor. The red light blinked rhythmically against her pale skin like a countdown. "Do you know what electricity does to a heart as delicate as yours?" He leaned in, his lips brushing her temple as she sobbed. "It stops it. It resets it. And I would have to spend hours bringing you back to life. I don't want to do that, Elena. I want you alive. I want you whole." He grabbed her hand, forcing her fingers to reach out toward the black box. She fought him, her entire body shaking, but his strength was absolute. He stopped her hand just inches away from the sensor. "One more inch and you'll feel it. A warning. Just a taste of what happens when you try to leave me." He is holding her trembling hand inches away from the live electrical pulse, testing her resolve. He jerked her hand back so violently her shoulder clicked, hauling her away from the humming sensor and slamming her back against his chest. The ozone still stung her nostrils, and the scorched rod on the floor was a silent, blackened witness to what he could do. He spun her around in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup her face with a terrifying, bruising intensity. He forced her head back until she had no choice but to look into the storm of his eyes. "You see that?" he snarled, his voice a low vibration that shook her very skin. "You almost hurt yourself, Elena. You almost destroyed the one thing keeping you safe in this godforsaken world. If I wasn't here to hold you back, if I wasn't here to guide your hands, you'd be a memory on my floor right now." He shook her slightly, his fingers digging into her cheeks. "I am the only thing standing between you and your own stupidity. Every wire, every lock, every pulse of that sensor is there because I love you too much to let you fail. I am your shield. I am your savior." Elena's breath hitched in a broken, jagged sob, her eyes darting from his face to the red, blinking light above them. The logic was twisted, a dark, suffocating web. But in the heat of his grip, it felt like the only truth left. "Tell me, Elena," he hissed, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from hers. "What do you say to the man who just saved your life? What do you say to the man who spends every waking second making sure you're protected from the world and from yourself?" He increased the pressure on her jaw, forcing her mouth open slightly. "Say it, give me the words I've earned." Elena swallowed hard, her voice a fragile, shattered glass sound. Thank you. Thank you for what?" he prompted, his eyes boring into her soul, demanding the full surrender. "Thank you for protecting me," she whispered, her head drooping in total defeat against his tactical vest. He let out a long, slow breath, his posture relaxing into a dark, satisfied triumph. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her terror and her submission. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice now terrifyingly gentle. The way one speaks to a wounded animal they've finally trapped. "Now let's go back to bed. You've had a very long night and I'm not going anywhere." He leads her back to the center of the room, the security system humming in the background. He guided her back to the bed, the mattress dipping under his weight as he laid her down. She was limp now, her spirit dampened by the ozone and the sheer weight of his protection. He didn't climb over her this time. He sat beside her, his large hand resting heavily on her stomach, a grounding, possessive weight that reminded her she was pinned even without the cuffs. "Rest, Elena," he murmured, his voice as smooth as velvet over a blade. "But listen, tomorrow your life begins, truly begins." He reached for the tablet again, the blue light washing over her pale, tear-streaked face. "7 RAR," he began, his thumb scrolling through a meticulous color-coded grid. "The lights will fade up slowly. I don't want you startled. I'll be here to wake you. You'll have 20 minutes to bathe. I've already selected your clothes, soft fabrics, things that won't irritate your skin. You won't need to choose anymore. I've removed the burden of choice from you." Elena stared at the ceiling, her eyes tracking the rhythmic red blink of the sensor. "Voice's breakfast," he continued. "I've designed a nutritional plan to keep you healthy, to keep your heart strong. You're a little pale, little bird. We're going to fix that. You'll eat every bite while I watch." His hand moved from her stomach to her hair, stroking the strands with a terrifyingly domestic tenderness. "From 09:15 to 12 you will sit at your desk. You'll write. I know you've been struggling with your chapter, but don't worry. I've installed a new keyboard. It logs every word you type directly to my deck. I'll be in the other room, reading as you create. We'll be connected even through the walls. And if I can't write," she whispered, her voice trembling. He leaned down, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "Then you'll sit there in the silence and think about why you're failing me. You'll have plenty of time to reflect. 13 is our time," he moved on, ignoring her shiver. "We'll walk the halls. I'll show you the modifications I've made to the rest of the house. You'll see how I've sealed the basement, how the kitchen is now a controlled environment. By sunset, we'll be back here. You'll read to me until the candles burn down." He set the tablet aside and lay down next to her, pulling her small frame into the heat of his side. He draped a heavy arm over her waist, pulling her back against his chest so they were tucked together like a pair of spoons. "No more strangers, Elena. No more unexpected visitors or frightening phone calls. Just this, just my voice, my rules, and my walls." He kissed the back of her neck, his lips lingering on her skin. "Do you have any questions about your new life? Or are you ready to close your eyes and let me take over?" He is holding her tightly, his heart beating a steady, dominant rhythm against her back. The adrenaline that had been keeping Elena's heart hammering for hours finally ran dry, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache, the weight of the day, the terror of the kitchen, and the crushing realization of her new reality acted like a physical sedative. Her eyelids felt like lead. She tried to keep them open, to stay vigilant, to keep a watch on the man whose heart was a steady, rhythmic thrumming against her shoulder blades. But the heat of his body was an inescapable blanket, and the scent of him, rain and cedar, was becoming the only world she knew. He felt her body go soft, the tension draining out of her muscles as she went limp in his embrace. He tightened his hold, pulling her even closer until there wasn't a sliver of air between them. "That's it," he whispered into her hair, his voice a low, dark lullaby. "Sleep, little bird. The world ended tonight. Tomorrow there is only me." Elena's breathing slowed, hitching one last time in a faint, subconscious sob before she slipped under. In the darkness of her mind, the red blinking light of the sensor followed her, a digital star in a black sky. She didn't dream of escape. She dreamed of the weight on her chest and the feeling of hands that wouldn't let go. He stayed awake. He watched her for hours in the flickering candlelight, his eyes never leaving her face. He watched the way her eyelashes cast long shadows on her cheeks and the way her lips parted slightly in sleep. He reached out and traced the line of her throat, the place where his hand had been only an hour before. She belonged to him now, down to the very molecules of her breath. He had built the cage, he had trapped the prize, and as the candles finally flickered and died, leaving them in the absolute silence of his fortress, he finally closed his eyes, a victor in a war she hadn't even known she was fighting. The first night has passed, and the sun is beginning to rise behind his reinforced light-blocking shutters. The light didn't come from the sun. Behind his reinforced steel-lined shutters, the outside world didn't exist. Instead, the bedroom lights hummed to life at exactly 07 Mer, a slow, simulated dawn that bled from a dim amber to a sterile, Unforgiving white. Elena stirred, her mind groggy and heavy, until the weight across her waist registered. She bolted upright, but the heavy arm draped over her didn't budge. He was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching her with the terrifying stillness of a statue. "Good morning, Elena," he rasped. His eyes were clear as if he hadn't slept at all, but had spent every second of the night counting her breaths. I need to go to the bathroom," she whispered, her voice cracking. She moved to slide out from under the covers, but his hand shot out, gripping her hip and pinning her back to the silk sheets. "Rule 1, Elena," he said, his voice dropping into that low, authoritative register. "You don't leave this bed until I tell you to. You don't move unless I say so." He reached for the tablet on the nightstand, checking the biometric feed. "Your heart rate is 90, you're anxious. Calm down or we stay here until you do." Elena squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her breath to steady. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. After a moment, he released his grip and stood up, towering over her in the artificial morning light. He walked over to the wardrobe, her wardrobe, and pulled out a set of silk lingerie and a soft, cream-colored cashmere lounge set. "I've removed your other clothes," he said casually, tossing the silk items onto the foot of the bed. "These are what you'll wear today. They're soft. I don't want anything scratching you while you work." He walked back to her, reaching down to grab her hand and pulling her up. He didn't let go as he led her toward the master bathroom. "You have 20 minutes, he said, opening the door. He didn't step back. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over his chest. Elena hesitated at the edge of the tile, looking at the shower and then back at him. Can you give me a minute? Privacy?" A dark, amused smirk played on his lips. "I told you last night, Elena, privacy is a lie. I've seen every inch of you through a lens for months. Do you think I'm going to stop now that you're finally within reach? The door stays open. I stay here." He tapped his watch. 19 minutes. "Little bird. If you aren't clean and dressed by 07:20, we skip breakfast and go straight to the desk. And I know how much you hate working on an empty stomach." She is standing in the bathroom, trapped between his gaze and the ticking clock. The silence of the bathroom was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system, the system he had modified to ensure she never smelled anything but him. Elena stood on the cold tile, her fingers trembling at the hem of the oversized shirt she'd slept in. She looked at him, pleading with her eyes for one last shred of dignity, but his expression was unyielding. He didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He watched her with a clinical, hungry intensity that made her feel more exposed than if he were touching her. 17 minutes, he reminded her, his voice a low, vibrating warning. With a shuddering breath, Elena reached down. Her knuckles brushed against her skin as she slowly began to pull the shirt over her head. The fabric slid up, exposing her midriff, then her chest, until she pulled it entirely free and stood before him in the harsh, artificial light. She felt the air hit her skin, but it was his gaze that felt like a physical weight. He didn't move, but his eyes darkened, tracking the way her skin pebbled in the chill. He wasn't just looking at her, he was cataloging her. He was checking for the faint bruises his grip had left on her wrists the night before, memorizing the curve of her waist, the slope of her shoulders. "Step into the shower," he commanded, his voice thicker now, roughened by the sight of her. She obeyed, her legs feeling like lead as she moved toward the glass stall. She turned the handle and the water hissed to life, steam beginning to swirl around the small space. As she stepped under the spray, she hoped the mist would hide her, but he simply stepped closer to the glass, his shadow looming through the vapor. He watched her through the transparent barrier, his silhouette a dark, predatory shape against the white tile. He watched her lather her skin, her movements frantic and clumsy under the pressure of the clock. "Use the sandalwood soap," he called out over the spray. "I threw the floral one away. I don't want you smelling like a garden. I want you smelling like my house." Elena grabbed the new bar of soap, her tears mixing with the water. She scrubbed her skin until it was red, desperate to wash away the feeling of being watched, even though she knew it was impossible. 3 minutes, he rasped, his hand coming up to rest against the glass. The heat from his palm left a clear print in the steam. When she finally turned off the water and stepped out, shaking and dripping, he was standing right there with a towel. He didn't hand it to her. He stepped forward, wrapping the thick, heavy fabric around her himself, his hands lingering on her damp shoulders. He leaned down, his lips brushing her wet temple. "You're learning, Elena. Compliance looks good on you." He pulled her out of the bathroom and back toward the bed where the silk lingerie lay waiting. "Dress quickly, I'm taking you to the kitchen for your first meal." She is shivering in the towel, the silk garments laid out like a costume. He didn't reach for the clothes. Instead, he backed away toward the heavy armchair in the corner, the one he had sat in for countless nights. While she slept, invisible in the shadows, he sat down, his large frame filling the seat, his legs spread in a posture of absolute dominance. He rested his chin on his interlaced fingers, his gray eyes fixed on her like a hawk watching its prey. "The towel, Elena," he said, his voice a low, steady thrum. "Drop it." Elena clutched the fabric tighter against her chest, her knuckles white. The steam from the bathroom was still evaporating off her skin, making her shiver in the air-conditioned chill of the room. "Please," she whispered, her voice a broken thread. "You've already seen. You've already won." "I haven't won until you stop trying to hide from me," he countered. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was patient. "You're still acting like there's a version of you that I don't own. There isn't. Every inch of your skin is my territory. Now show me you understand that." He didn't check his watch this time. He just waited, his gaze heavy and expectant. With a sob that caught in her throat, Elena let the towel go. It pooled at her feet in a damp heap. She stood there trembling, her arms instinctively starting to cross over her chest before his voice cut through the air. "Hands at your sides." She dropped her arms, her head hanging low, her hair damp and clinging to her neck. She felt the heat of his stare like a brand. It was a psychological stripping away, more invasive than the physical act. He was breaking the last barrier of her modesty, grinding her dignity into the floorboards. "Now the silk," he directed, gesturing toward the bed. With numb fingers, she reached for the lingerie he had chosen. She had to sit on the edge of the mattress to slide the silk over her hips, her movements jerky and humiliated. She felt his eyes on the curve of her back, on the line of her legs, tracking every shift of her body as she struggled into the garments. By the time she reached for the cream cashmere lounge set, her face was burning with a shame so deep it felt permanent. She pulled the soft sweater over her head, the expensive fabric feeling like a shroud. When she was finally covered, she stood before him, her chest heaving, her gaze fixed on the rug. He stood up from the chair, the movement slow and deliberate. He walked over to her, his presence swallowing the space between them. He reached out and tucked a damp lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers cold against her heated skin. "Look at me, Elena." She lifted her eyes. They were hollow, the spark of the fighter, from the kitchen now smothered under layers of exhaustion and forced exposure. "There," he whispered, a dark, triumphant smile touching his lips. "That's my girl. No more secrets, no more shame, just us." He took her hand, his grip firm and proprietary, and began to lead her toward the bedroom door. "Now come. I've prepared your breakfast. And after that, we have a lot of work to do on your book." He is leading her down the stairs toward the kitchen, his hand a permanent shackle around hers. The kitchen was unrecognizable. The warm, sunlit space where she used to drink her tea was now a sterile, high-tech command center. The windows were blanked out by the heavy shutters, and the only light came from the under-cabinet LEDs that cast long, sharp shadows across the granite. He didn't pull out a chair for her. Instead, he sat down heavily at the head of the island, where a single bowl of steaming oatmeal, sliced fruit, and a glass of water sat waiting. With a firm tug on her hand, he pulled her toward him. "Here," he commanded, patting his thigh. Elena froze, her gaze darting to the empty stools surrounding the island. I can sit there," she gestured weakly. His grip on her hand tightened, his thumb pressing into the soft skin of her palm. "I didn't ask where you wanted to sit, Elena. I told you where you belong. You're far too shaky to hold a spoon. I'm going to take care of you." He didn't wait for her to move. He reached out, his large hands hooking under her arms, and hoisted her up as if she were a child. He settled her onto his lap, her back against his broad chest, his legs caging hers. The heat of him seeped through the cashmere of her lounge set, a constant suffocating reminder of his strength. He picked up the silver spoon, blowing gently on the oats before bringing it to her lips. "Open," he whispered against the back of her neck. Elena's jaw remained tight, her pulse thrumming visibly in her throat. The humiliation of the bedroom was still a raw wound. And this forced infancy was the salt. "Elena," he warned, his voice dropping into that dangerous low rumble. He tilted the spoon, a drop of the milk landing on her lip. "Don't make me turn this into a struggle. This is about nourishment. This is about me ensuring you have the strength to be what I need you to be. Now eat." Reluctantly, her lips parted. He slid the spoon in, watching with rapt attention as she swallowed. He repeated the motion, his other hand moving to rest flat against her stomach, feeling the way she breathed, the way she trembled. "Good girl," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear as he prepared another bite. "See how much easier it is when you just let go? No decisions, no effort. Just the two of us, exactly where we're meant to be." He fed her slowly, meticulously, pausing only to wipe a stray crumb from the corner of her mouth with his thumb. Each bite felt like a link in a chain, binding her closer to him, erasing the boundary between her needs and his whims. "You're going to grow to love this," he rasped, his hand on her stomach sliding upward to rest just beneath her heart. "The peace of having someone who knows what's best for you. No more wondering, no more worrying. Just me." He has finished feeding her, and her body is slumped against him in a mixture of shame and forced comfort. He set the spoon down, satisfied with her compliance, and rose from the stool while keeping her tucked firmly in his arms. He carried her back upstairs in a silence broken only by his heavy, rhythmic footsteps. Entering her room, he didn't head for the bed. He walked straight to her writing desk, which had been cleared of everything except the new, glowing keyboard and a single glass of water. He settled her into the chair, leaning over her to adjust her position until she was tucked tightly against the desk. 3 hours, Elena," he whispered, his hands lingering on her shoulders to pin her in place. "The keyboard is logged to my tablet. If the typing stops for more than 5 minutes, I'll come back in to check on you, and you won't like the distraction I bring." He kissed the top of her head and walked toward the door. "Write for me. Show me the world inside your head, since the one outside is gone." The door closed with a heavy electronic thud and the lock engaged. Elena is alone with the glowing screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Elena's fingers hovered over the keys, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew he was watching the log, but she had to try. She began to type, her movements frantic yet calculated. She didn't write her novel. Instead, she buried a plea for help within the text, using the first letter of every sentence to spell out a desperate message. "Cvemeheischere." She hoped the raw data on his screen would look like a creative burst, a frantic flow of a writer finally finding her spark. Screams echoed through the valley, she typed. Always the shadows followed. Very few remained. She was halfway through her hidden message when the speakers in the room crackled to life. "Your syntax is getting sloppy." "Elena," his voice boomed, stripped of its gentleness and replaced with a sharp, cold edge. "You're thinking too hard about the structure and not enough about the story." The door to the room hissed open. He didn't walk. He stormed toward her, his face a mask of dark fury. He grabbed the back of her chair and spun her around to face him. He held his tablet in front of her face, the screen glowing with a red highlight over the letters she had just typed. "You think I'm an amateur?" he hissed, his grip on the chair so tight the wood groaned. "I built the software that's tracking your keystrokes. I saw the SOS before you even finished the word save." He reached down, his hand wrapping firmly around her wrist, and pulled her out of the chair. He leaned in close, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of betrayal and rage. "I gave you a pen and a purpose, and you used it to try and bring the world back into our sanctuary. You aren't ready for the desk yet." He dragged her away from the computer, his pace relentless as he headed toward the corner of the room where the heavy, soundproofed wardrobe stood. "You need a reminder of who actually hears you when you cry out," he growled. He is standing in front of the wardrobe, his hand on the handle. He didn't bother with the wardrobe. He wanted her where he could see the light leave her eyes. He hauled her back to the bed, the mattress groaning as he threw her down. Before she could scramble away, he was on top of her, his weight pinning her flat. "You want to send messages?" he snarled, reaching for the heavy steel cuffs he'd left on the nightstand. "I'll give you something to focus on." He grabbed her wrists, clicking the metal shut with a violent finality. This time, he didn't leave her hands free. He looped a secondary chain through the cuffs and anchored it to the heavy iron scrollwork of the headboard. The metal bit into her skin as he pulled her arms taut above her head. "There," he breathed, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged. "Now you can't touch the keys." You can't reach for anything but me. He sat back on his heels, watching her struggle against the restraints. The more she pulled, the more the headboard rattled. A hollow, desperate sound that only seemed to satisfy him. He reached out, his fingers tracing the red marks the steel was already leaving on her skin. You don't need the world to save you, Elena. Because the world doesn't even know you're gone. I've mirrored your social media. I've automated your emails. As far as anyone knows, you're just on a long private retreat. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, forcing her to look into the storm of his eyes. I am your only audience, your only reader, your only witness. If you won't write for me with your fingers, you'll learn to speak to me with your soul. He stayed there, hovering over her, a shadow that refused to lift. He is watching the defiance in her eyes slowly turn to a dull, flickering embers. He didn't say another word. He stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in his shirt with a chillingly calm deliberation. He gave the chain one final, sharp tug to ensure the locks were secure, then turned on his heel. Reflection is the only way you'll learn, Elena, he said from the threshold. I'll be watching. The heavy door clicked shut, the electronic lock engaging with a finality that echoed in the silent room. Then the lights began to dim. He didn't plunge her into total darkness. Instead, he left only a single, dim red light near the ceiling, the eye of the sensor, blinking rhythmically. Hours bled into one another. The silence was absolute, heavy enough to feel like a physical weight on her chest. Without the sun to track time, Elena's mind began to spin. Every creak of the house sounded like his footsteps. Every heartbeat felt like the ticking of a clock she couldn't stop. Her arms grew numb from being held above her head, the cold steel of the cuffs leaching the heat from her skin. She tried to stay angry, to hold on to the spark of the woman who had typed that SOS. But the isolation was a corrosive acid. It ate away at her defiance until there was nothing left but the ache in her shoulders and the desperate, humiliating craving for a human voice, even his. She found herself staring at the blinking red light, her breathing syncing with its pulse. He was out there, she knew, watching her on his screen, waiting for the exact moment her spirit finally bowed under the weight of the silence. When the door finally hissed open again hours later, the wedge of light from the hallway felt like a physical blow. He walked in carrying a glass of water, his shadow stretching long and dark across the bed. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood over her, observing the way her head hung low, her hair shielding her face. He reached down and hooked a finger under her chin, lifting her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were glazed, the fight replaced by a hollow, broken exhaustion. Are you ready to be a better listener now, Elena? He whispered, his voice the only sound in her entire universe. She is shivering, her body aching from the long hours of restraint. The metallic click of the key, turning, was the most beautiful and terrifying sound she had ever heard. He released her right hand, but as it fell, numb and heavy, he caught it midair. He didn't let it rest. He laced his fingers through hers, squeezing with a strength that felt like a new set of shackles. There, he murmured, his thumb stroking the raw, red line the cuff had burned into her wrist. Feel that? That's the feeling of me letting you back in. He kept her left hand pinned to the headboard, leaving her stretched and vulnerable, forced to lean into his space as he sat on the edge of the mattress. He brought her captured hand to his face, inhaling the scent of her skin before pressing a lingering, heated kiss to her palm. The silence did its work, he whispered, his eyes searching hers for that specific look of hollowed-out surrender. You've stopped looking for the door. You've stopped looking for the world. Now you're only looking for me. He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing her completely. You're finally ready, Elena. Phase 1 was about security, building the walls. Phase 2 was about compliance, teaching you to listen. But now, he trailed his lips down to her ear, his voice dropping to a jagged, possessive rasp. Phase 3 is about devotion. I don't just want your body in this room, and I don't just want your words on a screen. I want you to want to be here. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his expression terrifyingly earnest. Tonight you're coming out of this room. You're going to sit at the table with me, and we're going to act like the couple we were always meant to be. No more cameras, no more locks between us for 1 hour. Just dinner, and you proving to me that I don't need to chain you ever again. He squeezed her hand until it hurt, a silent reminder of what would happen if she failed this test. Can you do that for me, little bird? Can you show me that you're finally mine by choice? He is offering her a glimpse of normalcy within his twisted world. Elena looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the calculation behind the gentleness in his eyes. This wasn't a gift. It was a test of her psychological conditioning. He wanted to see if the hours in the dark had truly broken her, or if there was still a spark of the woman who would reach for a knife or a door handle the moment. His back was turned. If she ran, she'd hit the biometric locks and the electrical pulses he'd shown her. If she fought, she'd end up back in the cuffs, perhaps for days instead of hours. The dinner was a minefield disguised as a date. "You're testing me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. His thumb stilled against her palm. A slow, dark smile spread across his face, one that didn't reach his cold, predatory eyes. He liked that she was smart enough to see the cage even when he painted it gold. "I prefer to think of it as a graduation, Elena," he corrected, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous silk. "But yes, I want to see if you've learned that there is nowhere to go. I want to see if you can sit across from me and see your whole world in my face, rather than looking at the exits." He leaned in, his nose brushing hers. "If you pass, the cuffs stay off tonight. If you fail, if you even glance at a door with hope in your heart, I'll know, and you'll find out just how small this world can get." He reached up and unlocked her left hand, finally freeing her from the headboard. Her arms slumped down, heavy and aching, but he didn't let her go. He pulled her into his lap, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands. "Choose carefully, little bird," he murmured into her hair. "Dress for me. Be beautiful for me. And most importantly, be mine." He has released her from the bed, but the air is thick with the threat of what happens if she fails his dinner test. He watched her for a moment longer, satisfied by her silence before retreating to the door. 30 minutes, he warned. "Don't disappoint me." The door clicked shut. Elena didn't waste a second. Her body ached and her mind was a fog of exhaustion, but the realization that this dinner was a trap had sparked a final, desperate flicker of survival. She didn't look at the elegant, floor-length silk dress he'd left for her. Instead, she scanned the room with the eyes of a scavenger. The desk. She moved to the writing station, her fingers trembling as she searched the drawers. They were mostly empty, purged of anything sharp or heavy. But as she looked at the new, high-tech keyboard, she noticed the heavy, decorative metal pen rest he'd placed beside it, a solid, angular piece of brushed steel with a sharpened edge for holding fountain pens. It was heavy. It was solid. It was enough. She snatched it up, her heart leaping into her throat as she heard a faint rustle in the ventilation, the sound of him, or perhaps his cameras tracking her. She quickly tucked the cold steel into the waistband of the silk stockings he'd provided, smoothing the heavy cashmere sweater over it. The weight pressed against her hip, a cold, hard promise of resistance. By the time the door opened again, Elena was standing by the bed, the silk dress shimmering in her hands, her expression carefully blank. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately raking over her. He walked a slow circle around her, his hand trailing over the fabric of her sweater, his palm passing agonizingly close to where the metal was hidden. He stopped behind her, his breath hot on her neck. "You look compliant," he murmured, his hand sliding down to her waist, gripping her just firmly enough to make her gasp. "Are you ready to show me that you've let go of the world, Elena?" She nodded, her hand instinctively twitching toward her hip before she forced it to stay still. "I'm ready." He led her out of the room, his hand heavy on the small of her back. As they descended the stairs toward the dining room, the weight of the steel against her skin was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. They are seated at the candlelit table, the meal laid out with haunting perfection. He is pouring wine, his back turned to her for a split second. The dining room was a sea of shifting shadows and flickering candlelight. He had set the table with a chilling attention to detail. Fine china, heavy silver, and a bouquet of lilies that smelled of a funeral. He moved with a calm, terrifying elegance, filling her glass with a deep red wine that looked like spilled blood. Against the white tablecloth. "To us, Elena," he murmured, his voice smooth and satisfied. "To the end of your solitude and the beginning of our life." She didn't drink. She couldn't. Her entire universe had narrowed down to the cold, sharp weight of the steel pen rest pressed against her thigh. She played the part, nodding softly and keeping her eyes lowered, mirroring the submissive little bird he thought he had successfully caged. He finished his wine and stood, walking slowly around the table, The floorboards didn't even creak under his weight. He stopped behind her, his large hands resting on her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. "You've been perfect tonight," he whispered, leaning down. No glances at the door. No trembling hands. "I think you're finally beginning to understand that I am the only one who can truly see you." He turned her chair toward him. He dropped to one knee between her legs, looking up at her with an expression that was almost worshipful, if it weren't so delusional. He reached up, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I want to seal this promise," he rasped, his eyes darkening as he began to lean in. "No more locks, Elena, just you and me." She felt his heat. She smelled the cedar and the wine. As his lashes fluttered shut and his lips were inches from hers, Elena felt the surge of adrenaline she'd been waiting for. Her hand darted beneath the cashmere, her fingers locking onto the cold, sharpened edge of the metal. He leaned in further, his breath ghosting over her lips. His guard completely dropped in the moment of his perceived triumph. His eyes are closed, his face vulnerable and close. Her fingers white-knuckled the steel, the sharp edge biting into her own palm as she prepared to thrust it upward. This was the moment. His throat was exposed, the pulse in his neck steady and arrogant. But as his lips brushed hers, a cold, sickening realization flooded her mind. She pictured the blow, the blood, the roar of pain, and then she pictured him not falling. She imagined those massive hands, now fueled by adrenaline and rage, wrapping around her neck before she could even stand up. She thought of the biometric locks, the steel-lined shutters, and the silent house that only responded to his voice. If she failed to kill him instantly, the punishment would be worse than any cage she could imagine. Her hand froze beneath the cashmere. The metal felt like 1,000 pounds. The window of opportunity didn't just close. It slammed shut as she felt the sheer, overwhelming power of his presence. He was a mountain, and she was a bird with a broken wing. He felt the hitch in her breathing, but he misread it as passion or fear-turned devotion. He pressed his lips to hers, a slow, possessive kiss that tasted of wine and conquest. When he finally pulled back, he didn't see the weapon hidden inches from his gut. He only saw her wide, watering eyes and her trembling frame. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice thick with a dark, twisted tenderness. He stood up, pulling her with him until she was tucked against his chest, her hidden weapon pinned harmlessly between their bodies. "It's all right. The fear will fade. Soon, there will only be the peace of belonging." He began to lead her away from the table, not toward the stairs, but toward the heavy, reinforced door of the basement. "Come," he said, his grip tightening. "Since you've been such a good girl tonight, I'm going to show you the heart of the house. I'm going to show you exactly how I'll never let you go." He is leading her toward the dark descent of the basement, his hand a heavy weight on her shoulder. The cold metal of the pen rest felt like a brand against her skin, a secret weight that was now her only connection to the woman she used to be. She didn't drop it. She couldn't. If she let it go, she was letting go of the possibility of a final, desperate no. He led her down the stairs, the air growing cooler and the silence thicker with every step. The basement didn't smell like a cellar. It smelled of ozone and expensive machinery. When he reached the bottom, he swiped his hand across a sensor, and the room flooded with the clinical, blue light of a dozen monitors. "This is it, Elena," he said, his voice echoing with a pride that made her skin crawl. "The nervous system. I see the temperature in your room, the oxygen levels in the vents, the exact pressure of your footsteps on the floor." He walked her toward the center of the hub, where a massive screen showed a live, high-definition feed of the bedroom she had just left. It felt like looking at a ghost. "I've spent years preparing for this," he whispered, standing behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He pulled her back against him, his hands splayed across her stomach, inches from where the weapon was tucked. "The world is chaotic, Elena. It's loud and it's dangerous. But in here, everything is perfect. Everything is mine." He turned her around, his face illuminated by the flickering data on the screens. He looked ecstatic, a man who had successfully built a universe with a population of 2. "I'm going to register your biometrics into the main terminal now," he said, reaching for a sleek glass scanning plate on the desk. "Once your pulse is synced with the house, the walls will recognize you. You won't just be a guest anymore. You'll be part of the architecture." He reached for her hand, the one she was using to surreptitiously steady the weapon through the fabric of her sweater. He is reaching for her hand to press it against the glass, an act that will permanently link her to his fortress. The thought hit her like a lightning strike, clearing the fog of her fear. If the house was a body, this terminal was its brain, and he was about to give her the DNA required to access it. If she struck now and failed, she remained a prisoner. But if she let him sink her pulse and her prints, she wouldn't just be a captive. She would be a user. She forced her hand to go limp, letting the tension drain from her fingers. She didn't reach for the steel at her hip. Instead, she let him take her hand, her skin pale against his calloused palm. "That's it," he whispered, misinterpreting her sudden stillness as the final stage of brokenness. "Just let it happen." He guided her palm onto the glass plate. The surface was ice cold. Immediately, a thin green laser swept over her skin, and the monitors around them began to flicker with her data. Her heart rate, her temperature, the unique map of her iris, all of it flooded the screens, merging with his own encrypted files. "Access granted, secondary administrator." The system chirped in a sterile, feminine voice. Elena saw the terminal's directory tree expand on the main screen. She saw security, ventilation, external communications, and emergency override. The keys to her cage were flashing right in front of her. He let out a long, shaky breath, burying his face in the crook of her neck, his arms tightening around her in a celebratory embrace. He felt like he had finally won. He didn't see her eyes darting across the screens, memorizing the layout of the interface, her mind working faster than it had in days. "Now we're one," he rasped, his grip almost bruising. "The house knows you, Elena. It will keep you safe for me, even when I'm not in the room." She felt the weight of the metal pen rest against her leg, a physical backup plan, but her focus was now on the digital ghost of herself on the screen. She just needed one moment alone at this terminal, just 1 minute to find the external communications tab and see if he had truly blocked every signal, or if she could find a crack in his armor. He is still holding her, lost in his triumph. He let out a jagged breath of relief, his fingers finally loosening their possessive grip on her waist. "Wait," he murmured, his eyes fixed on a scrolling column of data. "The oxygen saturation in the bedroom is off by a fraction. I want it perfect for you tonight." He stepped back, turning his shoulder to her as he leaned over the console. He was completely absorbed in the minutiae of his control, his fingers flying across the glass interface. For the first time since the ozone filled her kitchen, his eyes weren't on her. This was the crack in the armor. Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't breathe. Her hand shot out, her finger hovering over the glowing, crimson icon labeled emergency override. The system recognized her instantly. The glass plate beneath her palm glowed amber as it felt her pulse, acknowledging her as a secondary administrator. Her fingertip made contact with the icon. A sharp, high-pitched chime echoed through the sterile basement. "What?" he started, his head whipping around, his eyes widening as he saw her hand on the terminal. Before he could reach for her, a deep, mechanical thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards. On the main screen, a series of red warnings began to cascade like falling dominoes. The heavy steel-lined shutters upstairs groaned as they began to grind upward, exposing the house to the world for the first time in months. The silent, suffocating vacuum of his fortress was suddenly punctured by the distant, beautiful sound of a siren triggered by the security breach. He let out a guttural roar of betrayal, his face contorting into something truly monstrous. He lunged for her, his massive hand catching the collar of her cashmere sweater. "You think you can just leave?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a terrifying mix of grief and rage. "The house is screaming, the lights are flashing red, and the outside world is finally pouring in." As he tackles her to the floor of the hub, as he slammed her into the cold floor, the air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. He was a crushing weight above her, his hands reaching for her throat to silence her, his face a mask of pure, unhinged betrayal. "I gave you everything," he howled over the wail of the sirens. "I made you safe." But Elena wasn't listening anymore. The sound of the shutters grinding open upstairs, the sound of the real world gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. As his fingers closed around her neck, her right hand swept downward, catching the cold, angular edge of the steel pen rest. She didn't hesitate. She didn't let the fear of his strength paralyze her. With a guttural cry of her own, she swung the heavy metal upward. The sharpened edge caught him squarely across the side of his temple. The impact was sickeningly solid, a dull thud that echoed even through the chaos of the alarms. He recoiled, his grip on her throat slackening as blood began to bloom dark and fast against his skin. He groaned, a sound of shock more than pain, as he sat back on his heels, clutching his head. He looked at her, his vision swimming, finally seeing the weapon in her hand and the fire back in her eyes. Elena didn't wait for him to recover. She rolled out from under him, her boots skidding on the slick floor of the hub. She scrambled toward the stairs, the red emergency lights painting the walls in flashes of crimson. Behind her, she heard him roar, a sound of a wounded predator realizing his prey had finally bitten back. "Elena, you can't survive out there. Come back." She didn't look back. She hit the stairs, her heart thundering in sync with the sirens. Every step was a breath of freedom. Above her, the front door's electronic seal hissed open as the override completed its cycle. Cold, fresh night air hit her face for the first time in months. She is at the threshold of the house, the night sky stretching out before her. The cold night air was a shock to her lungs, sharper and sweeter than the recycled oxygen of her prison. She reached the center of the manicured front lawn, the grass dew-slicked under the flashing red and blue of the security lights. The gravel crunched violently behind her. He was there, blood streaming down his face, his clothes disheveled, looking less like a god and more like a broken, desperate man. "Elena, stop!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He stumbled onto the grass, his hands outstretched. "The world will destroy you. You don't know what it's like out there anymore." She stopped. She turned slowly to face him, the steel pen rest still gripped in her hand, glinting under the strobing lights. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him from a position of forced submission. She was standing tall, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "The world might be dangerous," she said, her voice steady and echoing in the open space. "But it's mine to face. You weren't protecting me from the world. You were protecting your own shadow." He stopped 10 feet away, swaying. The sight of her, free, defiant, and holding a weapon, seemed to hurt him more than the blow to his head. The sirens were getting louder, the high-pitched wail of local police units tearing through the isolated silence of the estate. "I loved you," he whispered, a final, pathetic plea. "You loved a doll you could dress and a story you could write," Elena countered, stepping back as the first pair of headlights rounded the distant gates. "I am the ending you didn't see coming." She dropped the bloodied piece of steel onto the grass between them. It was a silent declaration. She didn't need his tools, his house, or his protection anymore. As the first police cruiser screeched onto the gravel drive, he fell to his knees, not from a wound, but from the crushing weight of his own lost control. Elena didn't watch them tackle him. She turned her back on the house, walking toward the blinding lights of the approaching cars, finally stepping out of his story and back into her own. Elena is sitting in the back of the police car, wrapped in a blanket, watching the house grow smaller in the distance. Weeks later, in the sterile quiet of a protected apartment, Elena finally opened the laptop the police had recovered from the house. Her hands shook as she navigated to the folder containing her manuscript. She expected to find it deleted or defaced, but instead, she found a new file titled "The Final Chapter." She clicked it. There was no story inside, only a single page of text, written in the same clinical, possessive tone that had haunted her for months. "You think the sirens ended us, Elena. You think the locks and the lights were the cage. But as you read this, you'll realize I'm still the only one who truly knows the rhythm of your thoughts. I didn't just watch you. I studied the way you breathe when you're afraid, the way you hesitate before you lie, and the way you look when you think you're alone. You'll go to the cafes, you'll see your friends, and you'll try to write a new life. But every time a door clicks shut, every time a light flickers, and every time you feel a stranger's gaze linger, a second too long in a crowd, you'll think of me. I didn't just build a house for you, little bird. I built a room inside your mind. I am the silence between your words. I am the shadow you can't outrun. You didn't escape. You just took me with you." Elena stared at the screen, the cursor blinking over the final period like a steady, mocking heartbeat. She realized then that his ultimate goal wasn't just to hold her body. It was to ensure she could never feel truly alone or truly safe ever again. Slowly, her finger moved to the delete key. She held it down until the file vanished, then the folder, then the entire drive. She shut the laptop and looked out at the city skyline, the vast, chaotic world she had fought to return to. The trauma was a weight. But as she watched the sun rise over the buildings, she knew one thing he didn't. A shadow only exists as long as there's a light to cast it. And she was finally ready to step into the sun. Elena is standing on her balcony, the city waking up below her. 1 year later, the city was no longer a chaotic blur of noise, but a landscape Elena had learned to navigate with a quiet, hard-won confidence. She walked into the inkwell, a crowded independent bookstore smelling of old paper and roasted espresso. She wasn't looking for the shadows anymore. She was looking for inspiration. As she wandered into the new releases section, her heart skipped a beat. There, displayed prominently on the mahogany shelf, was a cover that mirrored the nightmare she had lived. It featured a minimalist, haunting sketch of a bird trapped in a gilded digital cage. She reached out, her fingers steady as she pulled the book from the shelf. The title embossed in silver was The Silence Between Words. She turned it over to the back cover. There was no author photo, only a brief, chilling summary of a woman trapped in a high-tech fortress, a story written with such surgical precision that it felt like a ghost was whispering in her ear. Elena felt the old coldness stir in her chest. Had he done it? Had he somehow published his version of their life from behind bars? Was this his final way of haunting her? Of making sure everyone saw her through his eyes? She flipped to the front of the book to find the author's name, by E.R. Thorne. Elena let out a long, slow breath, not of fear, but of profound, triumphant relief. Thorne was her mother's maiden name. She opened the first page. At the very top in the dedication section were 4 simple words. For the girl who left. She hadn't found his book. She had finished her own. She had taken every clinical observation he had used to terrorize her, every moment of silence he had used to break her, and she had reclaimed them. She had turned his weapon into her art, stripping him of his power by putting it on a shelf for the world to see, critique, and eventually forget. As a stranger reached past her to grab another copy of the book, Elena smiled. She tucked her copy under her arm and walked toward the register, merging into the crowd, not as a victim, but as the author of her own destiny. Elena's story has officially reached its final, most powerful conclusion. She didn't just survive. She took ownership of the narrative. The end.